We were going to mainly be talking about the LA protests and Trump's approval rating, which we will talk about, but something came up very recently that really shook our whole state to the core.
Yeah, and I think that's really taken over the headline news. And even though here on the show we like to go behind the headlines, look at these long-term trends and look at these motives and what they aren't trying to show us, I think we really have to talk very briefly about the shooting of two of our representatives and their spouses.
As I'm sure pretty much all of you know, State House Speaker Melissa Hortman and State Senator John Hoffman, as well as their respective spouses, were targeted by an armed man who disguised himself and his car as police. And he entered their homes, which were like 8 miles away from each other, and gunned them down. Hortman and her husband did not survive, tragically, but Hoffman and his wife were able to make it to the hospital and are still alive as far as I know. This happened the night of the 14th, and a manhunt was immediately started for their suspect, a Vance Bolter, who had been, I think, identified at the first crime scene where Bolter had gotten into a shootout with the police and then gone out through the back door of Hortman's house and escaped. So then the police searched his car, were able to figure out it was him, found some kind of list of people, of politicians and other officials that seemed like a hit list. And while it did take a while, they did capture him on the night of the 15th. It was like southwest of the Twin Cities metro area, and he was like just west of his house in the woods. They were able to apprehend him without harming him. He's now on trial in federal court for, I think, 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Melissa Hortman because she was actually one of these standout lawmakers who was killed very tragically and almost assassinated in this way. Because, there's a very tight balance of power within the Minnesota legislative branch. Like, it's one of the tightest in the entire country. And Melissa spent a lot of her life just working for the betterment of the Minnesota community. So standardizing solar energy, passing community laws, increasing funding for education and the environment, and also helping to develop Brooklyn Park, which is the area that she was shot in. Working in many ways. I mean, not everyone agrees with it, but she did also work for diversity, equity, and inclusion in one of these really diverse areas of Minnesota. And part of that was probably she died because of those policies and those beliefs. I mean, this person was, deeply troubled, and I don't want to ascribe they have specific political beliefs, because this is just not really what people do. This is what crazy people do. But he had a list of other people that he wanted to kill involved with abortion and that sort of thing. In fact, they found some flyers conspicuously talking about these No King protests, which the shootings happened, I believe, on the 13th, and the protest was on the 14th. And these were nationwide, but in our state, a lot of them got called off because the threat that when he was loose at that point, that he might go and do a shooting. And in Utah, we saw an unrelated person actually go do a shooting at these No Kings protests. And a lot of our friends just didn't show up to the protest because of how dangerous it would have been. I know, Luca.
I was at the Bloomington No Kings protest, and by the time that the notice came out that people weren't supposed to be going to the protest, there was people had already assembled. It came too late. So for example, in St. Paul, the capital, there was already thousands of people gathered. I don't think a lot of them knew that the notice even came out because, well, I mean, a lot of people weren't looking at their phones. They were too busy holding up signs and chanting slogans. So, yeah, I guess you could say that a lot of people were unbothered if they had noticed, but I would mostly chalk that up to just not knowing.
Yeah, and it was pretty incredible. I mean, there was also other attacks on this protest. It's pretty funny when I was doing like my backup research because this isn't my topic. I look at the Wikipedia page and it had the U.S. They had like the military engagement like side card.
Oh,
Um,
awesome. Or not awesome, but you know.
and these were really large protests, like some of the largest in U.S. history. In fact, I think it's like within the top 5 largest protests in American history, which is incredible. And it goes to show that like proportion of the US population, let's say we lowball it to about 5 million, that's more than 1% of the entire US population because the US population is like 350 million. So 5 million is a significant amount of the US population at that point.
It's a lot more than the people that attended the parade.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the parade, I think, is kind of sad because this was planned, I believe, a little bit before the Trump administration came into office for the 250th birthday of the U.S. Army. And a lot of people defended it as just being like, this isn't really political, just Trump's in charge now that it's happening. And I kind of agree, but the fact is that even if Trump didn't do this like nepotism parade, the fact is he marketed the shit out of this, and he made it about him because he always does this. And we all, if you like Trump or you hate Trump, you know that he puts himself center stage, and he's a big personality in that way. And the truth is that he talked so much about this being like his parade, this his event, and I think he ended up making this very politicized. And listening to people who attended, I don't get the sense that like most people were like opposed to it or in favor of it as much as people were just sort of like it's happening, but it wasn't big enthusiasm, and I think that's kind of a shame because just like these shootings, this could have been a great moment for the U.S. to like come together and really appreciate something. But you know, the real lasting legacy of this, and it really angered Donald Trump that people didn't show up. He's like, "Where are all the people? Why didn't they show up? Why?" Like Kim said, he literally said, "Like, why when Kim Jong Un does this, people listen to him. Why don't they listen to me? I want
Well, yeah,
people to
that's
listen
because
to
they
me."
have to. That's because they have
That's
to go to the
yeah,
parades.
yeah. It's like,
He just
sorry,
needs to. He just needs to herd us up to the streets at gunpoints to line the streets of DC. Then he'll get
yeah.
his big turnout.
Yeah, and it's just the fact the president fixated so much on this parade increasingly wrapped him up in it. And at the end of the day, when you look at the polling, most people, which no one is opposed to the military, it's like the most trusted institution in the US. Like, well, some people are, but like it's the most trusted federal institution in the country, the military. And at the end of the day, people basically agree that this was way too expensive because the estimated total was like 25 to 45 million dollars,
Oh
which is a
yeah,
lot of money. But
plus the
like
damage to the roads.
damage to the road. Yeah, because getting tanks through and all that is very difficult. But it's just a very strange episode. I think people got a little bit too worked up about it. But in the end, I think it was something with a narrative we're going to unpack, which is Trump seems to be losing pace of a lot of these events. Like the shooting, completely unexpected. No one could have predicted it. But it also just doesn't really fit a lot into the narrative that they're looking for. And you've seen some of, well, broadly speaking, like elected politicians seeing an elected politician get shot. We're like, shooting elected politicians is very bad, which is true because murder is
Yes,
wrong, by the way.
only the
But
hottest hot takes here at America's
yes,
Wilderness
sir. Yes,
Years.
sir. What I
Yeah,
say is
just
that the interesting thing here is that, but you also then see people like Mike Lee, who's another like a federal senator, who then is just like making fun of the fact that they were killed, and this is like Tim Walz's fault. And even Trump, was caught on record saying that he wasn't going to call Tim Walz about the shooting of representatives because he doesn't like Tim Walz and that Tim Walz is a bad guy. And we see this in the Iran strikes. We see this in the LA protests with how that reflects deportations. And we also see it in this parade and in the shooting where Trump just overplays his hand so often. And let's get to the LA protest. But that's one thing I want to run through these events, which is Trump has spent all this effort, and we talk about this all the time on the show, of setting up these stories, these agendas, working us up for like each individual day. But here on the show, we look at the long-term trends. And a lot of the time, you see the weak gets away from Donald Trump. He comes out strong, but when he has to pay his bills, he isn't really worth doing it. And the big, beautiful bill, by the way, still hasn't gone through.
yeah. And speaking of overplaying his hand, LA is a pretty perfect example of this happening. I got a lot of my information about this from the LA Times. They have a nice little series of articles they're showing timelines. It gave me a better understanding of what was happening because in the first few days of the protest, I was not paying that much attention to it.
Actually, funnily enough, we mentioned the protests in LA in our last episode, like offhandedly, because this had been happening on and off for a couple of weeks, people protesting ICE because ICE was getting pretty excessive.
Yeah, and still going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the 6th, ICE really started to ramp up its sweeps of Los Angeles, especially downtown. They're looking for any undocumented people that they can find to,
And they're, like,
you know,
targeting small businesses they're targeting businesses and, like, areas that are specifically have a lot of illegal laborers.
yeah, there are a lot of businesses in LA that are owned by illegal immigrants.
Who used to pay their taxes to us with impunity and now obviously won't because we're using that to hunt them down. We'll get into that a little more.
The protests started breaking out on the 7th, and initially they were just localized in the communities being affected, but started to grow as well. The ice sweeps continued, and as word kept spreading of what was happening, and things kept growing more and more out of control in those areas. But let's be clear, this is not the entirety of LA
Less than
being
1% of
affected.
LA.
Yeah,
And these are mostly nonviolent. ICE is throwing tear gas canisters and using rubber bullets, but
yeah, and the police are coming in not really to disperse rioters or anything because there's barely any rioters. The police are coming in to make sure that the protesters and ICE are not coming into contact because, I mean, ICE aren't trained to be riot police. So when they see a bunch of angry people, they're going to be like, better start throwing tear gas
yeah.
or like, I better beat the shit out of them. But no, the riot police are more really there to protect the protesters than the other way around. Obviously, they're seeing footage of riot police doing things like hitting people with rubber bullets or detaining people, but
Yeah.
that's just kind of how you end up dispersing some things.
Yeah, so but eventually there is an escalation, like, there's people start throwing Molotov cocktails, and these are still mostly nonviolent, but you get to the point where there is a lot more physical violence being involved, and that's when
Yeah,
you get all these photos.
and it's in con camera. That's a big thing. Like this is spreading virally. You're getting videos of people dropping big rocks down from a overpass bridge onto police and their vehicles. You're getting
Yeah,
a lot
and
of insane. Getting a lot of insane scenes.
yeah, except for the funny thing is also, by the way, I, like, looked at a Google Images page of LA protests and LA riots, and it's like night and day what sources you see there. But like to keep in perspective, yes, there's violence going on, but this is never more than a few thousand people. I don't like sometimes it's like a couple hundred
Yeah,
people.
there's
Like
only been 500 arrests logged by the LA police. So
yeah, like this is not like this globe span, like this country, like really the way Trump administration presents this is because of like the ignorance of these Marxist leftist mayors. Basically, the good people of our country are occupied by these radical gangs
these
and in
invaders,
these
as some
invaders.
people say.
And this is why there's a lot of fear about him calling in the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to like basically use U.S. forces with a lot of legal impunity on U.S. soil, because traditionally that would be the realm of the National Guard. He did call in the National Guard because you're allowed to federalize the National Guard. Just the problem is the legal status of this is really weird. Usually you have to deputize the National Guard because soldiers don't really have a lot of legal authority in our own country. But
Yeah,
he did this without the approval of the governor, Gavin Newsom. And by the way, the last time this happened, I think, was like during the civil rights movement and like with like LBJ. So it's very like unprecedented.
yeah, and it's very shocking to see how the administration is trying to use social media and manipulate the narrative about this.
Yeah, but it's not just the administration.
Yeah,
It drives engagement for for these newspapers to sell a better story, even if it's wrong, because they're always competing for more clicks. They're
yeah,
not
the social
competing for like
media companies too.
yeah.
Like Instagram, there's a bunch of Instagram, probably Snapchat to videos and photos of all this stuff. This is great for these businesses, so they're like, yeah, let's drive engagement. So they don't care if all the stuff is showing burning cars and people fighting. It's just
It,
whatever.
well, it's hilarious because like I did some geolocations of like where a lot of these posts are, and it's like 3 blocks. This is not like a large. Well, I mean, but the point here is that this is problematic. Yes, National Guard gets called in. This caused a big tiff, and it's also worth noting that LA is sort of like this seen as this like liberal bastion within the U.S. So Gavin Newsom sparring with Trump is kind of a big deal because you have seen the Democrats be very quiet. And I will say, Gavin Newsom, whoever was running Gavin Newsom's social media team, was on point, staying like really really disciplined with their messaging, saying that people who are judging us for this are not doing anything. You shouldn't be usurping our authority. We have the right to make decisions. You're taking this way too far. This is our decision to make, which is true. This is like the whole point of
Yeah.
states' rights. And Trump get frustrated in trying to escalate this. Like when when Kristi Noem comes in, she literally talking about like how we had to liberate them, and it's like a large civil disturbance, but it is not like a massive engagement, and it's this trying to whip up this story regardless of the consequences.
And that's where Alex Padilla comes in, right? He's the California state senator. And, well, from the video that I assume most people have seen at this point, Padilla is at Kristi Noem's press conference, and he tries to start countering her rhetoric, asking like questions and saying, well, that's it's not true. You shouldn't, like, shouldn't be saying that.
Yeah.
And
Liberated? What the hell are you talking about? You just put like 1,000 occupying forces into this small town.
and the DHS personnel that are with her just shove him out of the room and handcuff him, put him on the ground until the hearing's over.
They're not stupid enough to arrest him, but you see this sort of
Yeah.
this freeness of force, which, by the way, if you're wondering, people have like the Second Amendment and we're like, you're supposed to be against the government. It's when the government is using excess force for basically no reason. And like, so he calls in the Marines because the Marines have like a reputation for being like roughnecks, like leathernecks and all that. And they don't really get to do anything. And it costs us a ton of money to deploy them anyways. And they're not necessarily the best equipped to handle the situation, but it's the appearance of action. It's the strong man thing we talked about so much, but it costs us money, and the bills are going to stack up. ICE deportations are relatively high, border crossings are down, but the cost has been insanely high, and they're doing this with like private contractors, and there's a ton of corruption. We've talked about this before, the massive level of corruption and deregulation that's going on behind all of this. So people are getting rich from this, but at the end of the day, when you look at this, everyone knows, if you're like credible at all, is that Americans don't like protesters. If you want to like seize control of your country, you see this emergency and you use it to seize executive power, and then you take over, which is the fear of the Insurrection Act. But it didn't happen because Trump administration, I guess, wasn't willing to commit to that, or it just wasn't seen like it was a good enough opportunity. But the truth is, most people were on the side of the government. They believed that these protests should have been they didn't agree with the protesters. Basically, 60% of people didn't agree with the protesters. But like a even larger majority of Americans oppose the deployment of like military forces against the protesters, which is incredible because that shouldn't happen normally, by the way, which is what really reveals to me is that this is Trump going too far, and that he tried to manufacture these theatrics, but at the end of the day, he went too far, and he could have totally gotten away with this. It totally could have been a win, but he went too far.
Yeah, I think the protests, while they did get smeared, the propaganda didn't fully work. I think a decent amount of people have gotten more of a negative viewpoint of the protests because they're like, oh, but it looks so violent. But even though, there's not actually that much violence. But when they still see the overwhelming force being brought to bear on this situation, it's like nobody thinks not many people think that is at all proportional.
Well, yeah, it's like at the end of the day, we saw like 5 cars get broken and like 1 car get lit on fire. And obviously no one's in support of that. But then the president is like, I need 10,000 men and 700 Marines. And I'm going to announce all of this on social media, and I'll have this. And like, just if you weren't paying attention to the news a lot of the time, your take would be there's these protests / riots in LA. We're not really sure how many people there are doing it. The government is hesitating the California officials are hesitating to do stuff because it's not a big deal, and it has to do with these ICE raids, right? And then the president says, I want to use the military. And then the state governor says, that's not something I want to allow. I'll take care of this. And then they go, you're betraying your country. I'm going to send in the Marines. And then you dawdle about the Marines, and we start talking about the money. And it's just the course of events is fast in the media, but it's not fast enough for all this stuff not to pile up and eventually slow Trump down. And I think that's one of the if this world ran on like a 15-minute news cycle, if the world ran on like the 15-minute attention span of people or like purely on social media, Trump would win every time. But the problem is he's just not reaching, just things are too slow for him. And now that
Yeah.
and also it's worth noting, remember, like, he is not facing like super serious opposition. The Democrats are largely like playing dead. The courts are like holding up against two branches of government. So it's normally supposed to be two branches against one. Now it's two against one, and the one branch, which is the judicial branch, is holding up their end. And he doesn't seem willing to defy the courts very seriously, even if he's maybe setting that up. I just can't emphasize this enough because I think too often the narrative is, for especially with like very progressive people, is, Trump is evil, he's doing all these bad things, and we have to stop him. And look what he's doing to us. I think a lot of it is just like he's struggling. It's hard for him to do this, and he has to muster up his strength. And a lot of the things he tries doesn't work. And when you really get behind the headlines, you see that consistently. And that's the crazy thing is, after these protests started getting simmering down, he released a memo where he basically said everyone in ICE really needs to step back, and we've been listening to business leaders, and we don't want to target key industries like agriculture and like leisure and like hotels and all of that. Which the timing of that is very strange, that you overplay your hand, you're having actual fights about these protests, and at the end of the day, you back down on these key industries, which predominantly rely on like immigrant labor, like undocumented immigrant labor. Like, you're not like protect, like, oh, I'm going to protect steel jobs, which immigrants don't really get anyways. And also, when you think about it, he overplayed his hand again because originally we had illegal migrants, right, paying below market rates and also paying their taxes because that was the standard of the time, and working these jobs, right? And they have a pathway to citizenship, right? But the Trump administration is now going to use those tax records to hunt them down, so they're not going to pay taxes, but they're still going to work their jobs. So we just lost money, not to mention all the money we're spending tracking these people down disproportionately. Is the Trump administration bringing down border crossings? Yes. Is it cost effective? We don't know. Probably not. The spending is massive. Is it massive infringements on our rights? Because we're seeing our elected officials and average Americans and like union leaders just getting beaten up by the police, and not federal police, not the police, getting beaten up by ICE. So the federal like immigration authority is just beating the shit out of people. Like, I can't have enough. Like, if the Trump administration was very serious, there's so much they could do, and they just failed to do it so many times.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how ICE went from an agency that was definitely not liked to top the number one hated agency of all time in the US.
Yeah, and there's some statistics I want to get at because because Trump is all about strength, but when you get into the statistics, and you can tell he's aware of them because he knows, and it worries him. So, like, for example, there was a Washington Post poll recently that said that basically everyone approves of like dealing with deportations. Public approval is high for deportations, right? But here's the thing: Trump's handling of deportations has a 37% approval rating. And in the Quinpack study, it's only 40% approval rating. So public approval for like dealing with legal immigration is very high because people don't like crime because they're Americans, right? The way
Mhm.
you're doing it is wrong. Like, that's very hard to do. I can't emphasize enough that's hard to do.
Yeah, there's been so much that's been botched. It's just like completely it's unignorable even for a lot of Republicans.
Well, it's funny because the truth is that there's a point in like early 2021 where Trump realizes if he endorses like candidates, they basically always win. And now there's a lot of Republicans who are only in their seat because they know Trump tapped them on the shoulder, basically. So in many ways, he's like holding the Republican Party hostage. And I'm actually curious about your feelings on this because before the Trump administration, you were really hesitant on Democratic policies because of abortion. And like, how does it feel to like have that like party capture experience?
Oh, of the Republican Party?
Yeah.
It's very concerning because it shows that our modern politicians can be roped into a system of personal loyalties and you scratch your back, I'll scratch mine kind of favors. And it shows that the parties and their power structures can be hijacked to serve individuals instead of a broader party agenda or a board of directors.
Yeah, and it's also very interesting. One more thing on the statistics here, which there was a poll also recently. There was another more thing statistic. I don't want to like quote numbers too much, but I think these are very insightful because the particular opinions of Americans are not like illustrated that much. And that's the fact is that Trump relies a lot on these vibes, this sense that things are going his way. And a lot of times people won't say that much, or they'll be like kept down because the algorithm doesn't really support because they're not saying it in an evocative way. But like if you believe the strongman narrative that Trump's reign Trump is special because he takes action. Most Americans actually don't think you should prioritize fast deportations. We should try to minimize damage. And like I think it's Benjamin Franklin who said that it's better that 100 guilty men go free than one innocent man go to prison. And we said this before. At the current rate, if the Trump administration moved to their original goal of 3,000 deportations a day, they'd basically be deporting like 30 Americans every day with no trial. It also part of me thinks about where's the line between they don't really care about like norms and rules and how much of to get what they want they have to improvise, and they get caught up in that. Like Doge got caught up in that. People get stuff kept getting leaked. People stopped getting identified. They started dissenting. Federal workers chose not to stand up. And the one thing, we're both big history buffs here, is in the long run, when the midterms happen, we shouldn't just think, okay, the Democratic Party returned and took the throne. But there was people who put in the long, hard work, and they weren't on social media all the time. There was people who put in the hard work to keep us around. There was government officials who didn't quit their jobs. There's people who respected like their oaths to their office. And there was people who like fought for what they believed in, even when Trump claimed to have this massive mandate.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go, would you be able to talk a little bit about our foreign policy situation and how Trump is doing on that front?
Oh man, oh man. First of all, I think we talked about this last episode, but the China deals are going nowhere, and the deadline for having all of these deals is catching up. It's got to be like what 20 days now, and they're saying we have all these deals, but who knows? The deadline's coming up. Yes, but that will be all from us, folks, for this week. Although next week, I really love to talk about the state of the Democratic Party, the New York mayoral election, because there could be some interesting stuff going on. There's a young, up-and-coming candidate coming to oppose the relatively unpopular Cuomo, which would be really interesting to get into because he's getting funding both from traditional Democrat donors and from traditional Republican donors. So that
Oh,
would be
wow.
fun to dig into.